All right, thank you, everyone. Thanks for attending this breakout session, which is called Card Sorts, Simple Tools to Provoke Unexpected Conversations. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. And just let me know if you don't end up seeing it. All right. So I'm going to take you through a little bit of some tools you can use in your conversations work. And just to give you a little background about what I do, I am creative director, managing partner at a design and research studio called Openbox. And we are united by our values, but at the same time, we're also united by the way we go about doing our design and research. A little bit of background about that is we really care about whether we're solving the right problem. So in traditional design, we are concerned with questions like how does something work and look and feel? And in what we do at Openbox is we incorporated a layer of research that comes before the design. And so we call that by various names. One of them is people-centered design, which is interested in questions such as what do people need and what do people want? So in trying to understand what people need and want and their aspirations, their fears, we go to where people are. So this might mean going out to a traffic intersection to talk to someone who is installing a new system for traffic cameras. This might involve going to Peru to look at the banking experience, people waiting in line for up to 3 hours to just see a teller. This could also involve going to Puerto Rico, for example, to learn what's on the ground, what people understand and know about Zika, right, when it was starting to become potentially an epidemic. So to go a little bit further into this last example, so in May 2016, I think much similarly to right now, the world was confronted with some new disease that they hadn't really been aware of. And that's when I was on a project to go understand what people in Puerto Rico knew about Zika. Our client wanted to understand how to properly prepare and communicate with the community there. So these are some of the locations I was in 2016. And we went around to different towns and cities and talked to different people and conducted different ways of serving and understanding people's thoughts about Zika. And to then jump right into the first example, card sorts. Card sorts involve cards. So literally, often it can be physical cards. And in this case, I'm going to start with the simplest example, which is just 4 cards on each one of them, and I'll show you photographs in a second, of a disease caused by mosquito. So we have Zika, malaria, dengue, chikungunya, and a 5th card that you can see here is blank that allows people to fill in their own disease. And the idea behind a card sort is you allow people to arrange the cards according to a certain order. In this case, I asked people to rank them according to how much they were concerned about the disease, how little they were concerned about the disease. And so when I took these cards, and you can make them very simply, you can see here, I just did them on Post-its. And it was because of the limited time we had to work on this. So it's very scrappy work, but the concept itself is the most important part. So you can do this very easily. And I asked people to just sort these cards. Let's rank them in the order that you're most concerned about to the least concerned about. And you see this happening here. You see it happening where then people take that 5th card and they write out the diseases they're more concerned about than any of those 4. And cancer, AIDS were often the ones that people would write. And what was really interesting is then asking people why. Why do you put Zika second? Why do you put Zika last? Why does cancer go above all of them? And I'm going to talk specifically about this one example where a young man said, listen, I have family members, I have friends who work in hospitals. No one's encountered a case of Zika. So I'm not going to even put Zika in the lineup. And you can see this happening in the photo here where he pushed it out of our card sort. And even though he wanted to do that, it was actually great. A no often in conversations gives a lot of information to us. And by asking the no, we understood that because Puerto Rico has had this history of feeling like they were the lab for a lot of studies. For example, the birth control pill was first tested in Puerto Rico, not on mainland US. There was a suspicion and mistrust that was really inherent in the history there. And so there's a feeling that maybe Zika was not real, not this similarly to what we have encountered over and over throughout the history of diseases and governments. And so this simple activity using just 4 cards, asking people to put them in a certain order, allowed us to have very deep conversations that were, in some ways grounded by the things that people were moving in front of them. A second example in the same project is taking different cards, this time cards that had just statements on them. And we asked people to say, are these true or are these false? Can we sort them according to whether you think they're true or false? And so I'll just go over these quickly. The content isn't as important as just the activity. Zika is transmitted by mosquitoes and insects. Zika doesn't have a cure or vaccine. Zika mosquitoes can bite during the day. Only 1 out of 5 people show symptoms. The symptoms last 2 to 7 days. And, again, remember, this is 2016, just happening. The asterisk is to annotate that this is what we knew at the time. The Zika virus could last 2 to 6 months in your body. And one of our motivations as designers and researchers in doing this exercise at a time when everyone knew so little about Zika was to say, we don't want to confuse people. We're doing our research, but we don't want to, in the process, unethically confuse people about what the facts are. So why don't we just make them all true statements? So in fact, these are all true. And it doesn't really change what people might guess. And in fact, what turned out to happen was people were stunned when they realized that these are all true, and we told them after they had taken their guesses at them and sorted their cards. So you can see this is in the moment, visiting someone at home, going through the cards one by one, explaining them. This is another way we use these cards, just as a self-standing station where people could, and we took this to different locations, people could actually drop marbles into jars as a way to vote on which facts they thought were true and false. True, rather, you drop it into the jar if it's true. And you can see in this group also, it's a group of young university men, because the fact that it's transmitted by sex means that you can't just talk about, the effects of it on pregnant women and their fetuses. You have to involve men in the conversation. And everyone, once they learned that these cards, true, false cards, were all true, they were just stunned by the fact that this is something to really take much more seriously. So the cards themselves and the exercise provoked them to think really hard about what they thought they knew and look at the disease in a more holistic sense. A third example of card sorts in action. Here are 15 cards, the first 5 rows, of historical and current figures from Washington, D.C. You have at the bottom, additionally, Mies van der Rohe, who is an architect, a modernist architect, who built the Martin Luther King Jr. Memorial Library in Washington, D.C. And so this is a project for the MLK Library in D.C. And they were renovating this building that van der Rohe had built and wanted to include an exhibit on the 4th floor to host DC stories, but they didn't know which DC stories, what locals would consider DC stories. And so we tried, we interviewed people as part of our process, but we tried also, again, to include a different kind of card sort in this case, and said, here are these 16 cards, different Washington, DC figures. If you had to pick 3 of them to invite to a dinner party, and here we have the dinner party placeholders for your name, who would you invite and why? And this allowed us to really surface, a pattern, which is that Marion Barry, often called the mayor for life of DC, was a really important figure to include that the library hadn't actually considered. And over and over again, and in later prototypes that we made, people would, prototype exhibit panels that we would install in the library, people walk by Marion Barry's panel and salute it. And so this goes to show that you can really surface some interesting stories just from having these activities that people then could really react to. And on the other hand, this is again, people are reacting to Marion Barry. This is someone we need to tell the story of, if we're going to tell a DC story. On the other hand, Mies Anderow, who built the library, a lot of people we spoke to, longtime residents, creatives, they really singled him out as someone who just didn't belong in the pile. I mean, he isn't from Washington, D.C., and the fact that he built the library, the Memorial Library, didn't matter to them. And so they're very conscious of who is DC and who is not DC. And that allowed the library also to appropriately scale the amount of information that they needed to include about the architect who built the building and whose building they were renovating. So if we were to think about how to use card sorts, you've seen 3 different examples of cards used in different ways, and you could come up with your own activities to really get at some of the questions you want to provoke interesting conversations around. First, one card, one idea is very important. You want to have people be able to sort them, to shuffle them, to pick one out of the others. So you can't put all of the information on the same card because then you can't really sort them or mix them up. Keep it short. That means both what is on the card and then the set of cards. I think generally maybe 4 to 5 cards is a good number. Staying under 10 would be great. You saw in the library dinner party card sort activity that there were quite a few more. And you have to really be conscious of why you're doing it and what the activity involves, because then you have to go through and explain to everybody. And I do take the time to walk people through each of the cards, make sure they know what it says and what it means. And it takes time to then also sort them. If people had to rank 20, 30 cards, that's going to take them forever. And I don't know if you've ever done exercises, surveys online. We have to order things from 1 through 10. And after you do a couple of those, it becomes quite difficult. So keeping it short is important. And the last thing is to, as you're talking to people, ask them to narrate out loud their thoughts, not just to sort, but to talk through what they're thinking about, because that's a really important piece of the conversation, people's inner thoughts. And you want to listen to the why. Why did this come before this? Why is this not included? You didn't talk about these at all. Why is that? And the why is really what's going to give you the insights into the thinking that people have that might not be so easily communicated otherwise. And so hopefully this is going to be something useful to you going into having different kinds of conversations. And I hope you have many happy provocations using card sorts and trying them out. And I'll just pause here and see if we have any questions potentially or comments about this presentation. You can feel free to enter your questions or comments in the chat, and I can see it, so I can answer them as they come in. I do have lots of examples of cards. It's almost the foundational activity that you do. When we do a lot of interviews, you can imagine people who are just talking to each other. It's fine, it's important, but it's always helpful to do a little bit of concrete activities together. It helps make things a little bit less awkward at times. You do an activity and people are less on their guard, and so I think there's so many, and I think I wanted to pick out the ones that were really the best examples of just getting to show you how they could change or provoke reactions that you might not have otherwise come across. Yeah, I'm glad it's a good idea that you think you might be able to use. It depends on in terms of how many people to participate in this. In our practice, in my practice of our research at our design studio, over the course of a client project, we might speak to maybe 15 people. It's a very deep kind of conversation. So cards, you're just seeing one facet of the whole conversation. We might visit people at home for 3 hours, let's say, and we might follow them around as they, go to the bank and understand, what their experience is. So shadowing people. And so because it's such a deep kind of qualitative research, as opposed to, surveying people, 5,000 people, a quick, 3-question survey, it's not a lot of people. And so it's actually pretty small but deep. And group activities could be a really good way to do it as well. Absolutely. And yeah, during COVID, there are ways to also do this online. If you use any online whiteboard, or Miro is a great way to also, have Post-its moving around. Yes. This is where you really want to have those deep conversations and provocations for those deep conversations. So rather than numbers, I think activities such as this and other activities that exist in our research really help with surfacing that insight. Thoughts about coming up with the content of the cards. I would start with trying to figure out what you want to learn in your conversation. So, in a lot of cases, there's a higher level, strategy, what is a DC story? And this is exactly why cards come in so handy, and why that kind of high level question needs to be broken down a little bit further. Because if you just come out and ask people these big questions, sometimes I think of them as like looking at the sun. You don't want to look at the sun. It's going to harm your eyes. You can't do because it's so big. People might have trouble answering very concretely. It might become too broad or too cliche, and it's hard. It's just a hard question to answer, or for me to come up and say, what are your values, right? These are just so big. So breaking them down to smaller activities, how can you go about breaking that big question into lots of smaller questions? And at some point, being creative and saying, well, here's a smaller question. What is a way, if I had to put some content on the cards, what examples, what words, what things can I actually put, one idea per card to provoke some of the same reactions. So I think we're at time. And I hope this has been really helpful. Thank you so much for all of your questions. This is great. And I really wish you, deep, insightful conversations going forward. Thank you again.